Let's
stories
roll.
of Brisco and Bradshaw. I would be Bradshaw. That would be your Chickasaw native, your Chickasaw Hall of Famer, Oklahoma's favorite son, Mr. Gerald Brisco. And we got a treat today. We're not talking about Hamilton. That's been barred from us. We got Toronto Maple Leafs. We got Mr. Greg Oliver. He's written 7 books on wrestling, tons of books on hockey. And he has the owner and founder of Slam Wrestling. Mr. Greg Oliver, welcome to the show.
And he wrote a book on baseball too, John.
Oh, I didn't know that. You wrote a book on baseball?
Yeah, with John Gibbons, the former Blue Jays manager, who's now the bench coach with the Mets.
Really? What was? Tell me about the book. I'm sorry, I missed that somehow when I was doing research on you because we're trying to talk about Hamilton.
Well, it fell into my lap during the pandemic. John Arezzi, who you guys know, did a lot of stuff through the years in baseball and country music, and he's been a connector, and he connected me up with John Gibbons, and we wrote his book. It was a #2 bestseller in Canada, so that was pretty cool. I didn't do a lot in the States, but he hasn't really done a lot in the States until now with the Mets. The highest profile job he's had in the U.S. for sure.
You a big baseball fan?
I am. I'm just a big sports fan in general, and it's just been a part of our lives always growing up. And so, as great as it is to write about pro wrestling, the chance to do sort of more legitimate stuff and talk about baseball and hockey.
Hey.
So you're talking baseball and hockey's not legitimate or what?
Yeah, exactly. That it's a fix. The Celtics winning last
I
night.
always thought about hockey.
Sorry,
And if it was fixed, there would be a Canadian. When's the last time there was a Stanley Cup champion from Canada?
1993. You're right.
Wow.
Not done yet.
They even play hockey up there anymore?
Yeah, well,
I didn't know that.
I know the state of Florida's won four Stanley Cups in the last decade than the entire country of Canada, right, John?
Yes, unbelievable. Florida is the home of hockey.
Yeah, well, that's it.
Now.
Hockey City, USA.
All the kids play it down there in the Florida swamps when they freeze over.
Yeah, with no air conditioning. Pay your damn bills, Greg. Maybe you'll get air conditioning.
We'll be okay.
And use American
start
money.
The show or what?
Canadian money.
See, now you're getting mad at us.
No, I just,
We hadn't brought up Hamilton one time, and you're already mad at us.
Already bad. Speaking of which, John, what a great guy! I mean, we got on here, man. The wrestling knowledge that he has, the article that he's written throughout the years, are all just fantastic, man. But we're here to talk today about Toronto, Canada. Is that in Alberta or where's Toronto?
Toronto, Ontario, Canada. But you're going to see it right. It's Toronto. So you say it like Tranna. Toronto is how.
Now you sound like Earl Hebner.
Oh, there you go. Well, is that a good or bad thing? I don't know.
It depends on if you're in Canada or not. Earl Hebner.
Earl David, great guy, good friend of the show.
We love Earl. I'm not sure all of Canada does. Hey, wait a minute. I got to ask you a question. I read that you named like Bret Hart like number 48th greatest Canadian or something.
This is off topic.
It's way off topic. I heard Skylo Low was ahead of him.
Okay. You often tell this story. I called Gene Kiniski and I said, Gene, you're number 6 in the all-time greatest Canadians of all time in the book I wrote called Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, The Canadians. And Kiniski got all upset. And then I said, Gene, can I tell you who's ahead of you? And he goes, okay. So I said, it's Whipper Billy Watson, Yvonne Robert, Killer Kowalski, Mad Dog Vachon, and Earl McCready. And Kiniski just goes, I'm okay with that. So there's a lot of ego involved in wrestling, and there always should be. But yeah, I had Bret at 14, and that upset him, and that's fine. You're entitled to be upset.
So you had to put an American ahead of Bret Hart, Killer Kowalski, right?
He's from Windsor, Ontario.
I thought he was from Boston.
No, he's from Windsor, Ontario.
Oh, thank you. See, that's the great thing about our show, Greg. We're educational.
That's right.
I just learned something today that I didn't know. Thank you very much. So,
but Mr. Brisco, you cannot talk about Windsor. We have been banned. You got to talk about Toronto.
Toronto.
We have strict instructions.
Well, okay, let's go, Greg. Let's go about Toronto. Back in the early 30s, I believe 32 or somewhere like that, you guys had a pump promoter there that that started wrestling in there. Can you tell us a little bit about his background and everything?
Well, the rise of wrestling in Ontario, especially in Toronto, which has been the biggest city in Canada for a long time now, really mirrors what happened in the US, right? Where, in the 1920s, you started getting the bigger names that were able to travel around, and there was an established promotion by a guy named Ivan Michalek, who was like he was Russian by birth, I believe. Anyways, but he lived around here. He'd been a wrestler himself and set up a little promotion. It wasn't really big in the sense, but you brought in the bigger name talents once your Jim Londuses and those guys came into town. It was the same as almost anywhere else where the newspapers would write about these big names coming in. So it's not really all that foreign a city in many ways. Toronto was a lot like any US city. Wrestling got a hold on there. And then, Michalek decided to try his luck out west and left. And that left an opening in Toronto, and that brought in Jack Concoran, who is basically the start of what we know of Toronto wrestling or Maple Leaf wrestling.
And they had, what arena were they running in? When was the Maple Leaf Gardens first?
That's a really good point. So there was the Mutual Street Arena, which is a smaller arena, which is where the hockey actually started when the NHA, which was the forerunner of the NHL, started, was like 1912. So they were running places like the Mutual Street Arena. There were smaller arenas around that they'd also do wrestling, but it wasn't until Maple Leaf Gardens was opened in the height of the Depression in 1931 that wrestling really had a truly great home, and wrestling ran there right up till it closed in 1999. Maple Leaf Wrestling was a great place to wrestle. I think you went there at least once, right, Gerald? Not very many though.
Yeah, not many. I basically worked there for Jim Crockett Jr. when they were running Toronto.
Right, they were partners with the Tunneys and George Scott up here in Toronto. But that jumps ahead a little bit.
Yeah, you are jumping ahead there. To see, we're trying to stay on script here, and you tell us what we can do.
It's not a
you're the first guest to come on here and supplied us with a wonderful list of suggested topics there, which we greatly appreciate.
Wait, Jerry. We have a wonderful list of suggestions and topics, but also a list of what we can and can't do. They're like instructions, like don't do this, don't do this. We'll do this. We'll do this later. We'll do this maybe another time. It was a whole list.
Now that you're off the hot seat, Greg, let's get rolling.
Hey, Greg, when they had running back then, but way before TV, obviously, what was the schedule like? Where did they run the big show, the Maple Leaf Gardens, every week? Did they run other spot shows regularly? What did the territory? Was it even a territory? What did it look like?
Yeah, there really wasn't too often, and they had to work around obviously hockey schedules. Because that always had priority, and that was the case in almost anywhere. If you look across Canada, we actually had summer promotions, which are not something you see in very many other places. But in Canada, we had summer promotions because the hockey arenas didn't have air conditioning, and they'd be too hot in the summer for hockey. And so you'd run those arenas in the summer. Certainly, Emile Dupre out east was like that. But yeah, there weren't regular shows, like they'd be every 2 weeks, every month. There would be, it's really hard to find some of those small shows, but they do exist. They're just, wrestling wasn't really part of the popular culture, I guess. And so not every newspaper would treat it with legitimacy. It wasn't until the 40s and the 50s when Maple Leaf Wrestling with the Tunneys really got established, that they had sort of paid guys that worked at the newspaper that they would be, sending the regular booze to and whatever to be able to get good coverage in the newspaper, that wrestling all of a sudden was there regularly in the paper.
So the success.
Jack, how do you pronounce it? Cochran?
Corcoran.
What was his background? How did he get involved? How did he bring the first wrestling, and who were some of his great stars? Who was his first big star there?
Well, he didn't really last that long, right? Because Michalek leaves, Concoran comes in, but more importantly, the matchmaker that works for Concoran is John Tunney. And we all know the Tunney name associated with Toronto, but John was actually the first one. And so he was a matchmaker with Concoran. But they're always bringing in guys from everywhere, right? There wasn't really a homegrown star. Toronto, for the longest time, wanted people, in fact, it was always the case, right up till Edge and Christian had to leave town, because there wasn't really a spot for them here. You had to go work somewhere else and then maybe come back as a bigger star. That was
That's it.
almost always the case because, and I bring this up because the biggest star in the history of Canadian wrestling was Whipper Billy Watson. And he
Right.
started in the late 30s, but he couldn't get a break in town. He couldn't get a break in Toronto in the late 30s, so he's working in England in 36, 37, and he comes home just before World War II really breaks out. And finally, he gets in with the Tunneys. So John Tunney gets sick, he dies, and his brother Frank takes over. And then Frank Tunney takes over in, was it 1940? And ends up running the promotion until his death in 1983. Whipper Billy Watson became sort of his right-hand man and his top star, which is often the case, right? You need somebody to push that you're going to trust. And that was Whipper. I've never actually truly learned how many points he owned in the promotion, but it's pretty obvious when you look at the results and everything he did through the years that Whipper owned points in Toronto as well.
So it seems like the stars came more from America, that made a name, or the stars that left Toronto, went to America and came back, more so than Quebec, which actually was creating some of their stars in a pretty hot territory there with Robert and a few others.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, in Quebec, it's just so unique, right? As far as North American wrestling goes, they had their own culture, they had their own stars. Those guys may not work anywhere else. I mean, even Robert would be coming into Toronto, and some of the Toronto guys would be going to Montreal. So there was talent exchanges going on there. But those guys didn't necessarily translate. Often they would come in and they'd anglicize their names too, because it didn't necessarily make sense. Like, Ovila Asselin doesn't really mean a lot. So you put him under a mask and he's like a mask marvel or whatever you got to do to make it work. But yeah, the Tunneys really took off, and a big part of that was because of Whipper. And he just had the charisma, right? That it factor we were talking about a little bit off air that, you can't predict. And he was not the most amazing looking wrestler. Like, he wasn't jacked or anything like that, but he just had that it factor where everybody fell for him, right? You really wanted to cheer him. He had his own fan club. He had a safety club across the country. He had a line of a pop or soda, as you Americans call it. He had some weight equipment that he sponsored. All these different things that he did just made him like a bigger than possible star. Like, he was one of the
That's what
biggest
I
stars
really
in Canada.
enjoyed about your notes here. The weights, I wasn't aware of that. What were these? Like a weeder type weights, or was it a
Yeah,
copy of
exactly.
that? Or
Yeah, they're just dumbbells that had Whipper Watson on.
yeah,
So at some point he just made a deal with somebody and they sold them. I don't know how nationally they were sold, but it's still pretty cool. And I don't think there are too many other wrestlers that ever had a gig like that.
There's a lot of dumbbells in Oklahoma. I don't know whose
I'm
names
out
on
of
them.
here.
I don't know whose names on them, but I just thought that, yeah. Say, what is
Thanks
a
for
safety
throwing that
club?
in, John.
What is a safety? What is it? You said a safety club? What was
Yeah,
that?
well, it's as simple as, he would go speak in schools, and like Elmer the safety elephant. Isn't that the US one that I'm thinking of? So it's just that idea, walk across the street safely, look out for your friends, watch out for, strangers in white vans. I don't know. That's getting a little ahead of time because there weren't a lot of that in the 50s. But, it's just that idea that you really want, if you make the kids fans when they're little, when they grow up, they become bigger fans. And that worked for Whipper. I mean, he lasted right up until he got injured, and was it late 1971, early 72? He was actually near my hometown of Kitchener, Ontario, where he was out and getting something out of his trunk, and a car slid into him on the ice and wrecked his legs. And so he was never able to wrestle again, but he was still involved with wrestling. But what makes it fascinating, though, is he was such a philanthropist. He was just so involved with the communities. He'd always been a part of the Easter Seals, where we had Timmy and Tammy, which are the little kids that were coming out. We called them crippled kids back then. Obviously, they're differently abled or handicapped. But Whipper was a champion of them, and would bring them into the ring and celebrate them. And so when he got hurt, he doubled his efforts, if anything else. And he got out there and he was even more visible in the community, raising money, just being a good person.
When did Wilper first come back to Toronto?
He would have been coming back, well, just before the war. He
Just
managed to
before
come
the
back
war. And
just
did he
before the
start
war.
becoming a big name then?
Now, yeah, it takes a little while to build, but it was, what was it? 47 was the first time he won the title in Toronto. Well, it wasn't in Toronto, but he becomes the NWA World Champion before it was the National Wrestling Alliance. So he'd already made the political connections with Tunney, obviously as his big advocate, and so they were big players nationally. And again, he never had a lot of exposure in the United States, so neither of his two title runs lasted very long. But in Canada, he was essentially what we like to call today a household word. Everybody knew him. The television across Canada in the 50s that was out of Maple Leaf Gardens was seen across the country. So Killer Kowalski, he comes in here, or Gene Kiniski comes in and he fights Whipper Billy. They can now take that feud wherever they want. There's a story where Whipper Billy Watson's in Newfoundland on the far east of Canada, and he gets off a plane and there's seas of people there waiting to see him. And that's just what kind of a big star he'd become because of television.
So he became the big star, say, in 1947, and then all of a sudden you have the advent of television. He was the perfect person to be on television to take it across Canada, because obviously wrestling was one of the easiest things to shoot, just like late night talk shows was one of the easiest things to shoot.
Right, and boxing would be the other one. There was a one camera deal, but yeah, no, I know, like I've told this before, but I think it's very true that in Canada we had Whipper Billy Watson, who I just talked about all his laurels and what a great guy he was, and he was our first big star on television. But in the U.S., there was this nasty guy named Gorgeous George, right? So that's the dichotomy of Canada U.S., isn't it? That you have this villain who becomes this first great big known televised wrestler. And then in Canada, he's a good guy. In US, he's a showboating bad guy.
Which promoter was it? Was it Frank that first got the TV, or was it their first one, Jack?
No, it was Frank, because the TV was a little bit later here in Canada than it was in the US. So by 1951, 52, we started the Canadian Broadcasting Network that went across the country. So yeah, it was a little bit later than what the US had, as far as like Gorgeous George was already a national name on television by like 48, 49. And TV
Were
was
you
just
guys getting in Toronto, because it's so close to the border? Were you guys getting US TV at the time?
well, not that I was around then. You
Well,
might have
you
been.
were,
Mr.
yeah, not
Briscoe,
that
but
you were around,
Wow.
but
Wow.
if you would have been
Wait,
around.
He said you might have been.
Well, I was, but not in Canada, because they have no
so
air conditioning up there.
No, they don't have any air conditioning. They have a lot of mooses.
Yeah, have Molson's.
Mooses and
well,
Molsons.
yeah, I'm gonna need a Molson after putting up with you two, but it's all good. The question was about television.
Yeah,
Television.
did you get any of the Gorgeous George shows up in Canada?
Well, but again, as TV starts, it takes a while before everybody has a television. So if we're not getting TV on a national basis until 52, it's not till the mid 50s when most people in the country would have a TV. And so by then, Gorgeous George is not as big a name. But yeah, for sure, he came up here. He had a run with Whipper at Maple Leaf Gardens where he got his head shaved. So yeah, that's a big part of it. If you talk to anybody who grew up in Canada, almost all of our population is within, I think it's within 3 hours of the US border. And so no matter on where they lived in the country, they'll talk about a US channel that they got. So if you're in Vancouver, you're getting the Seattle station. If you're in London, Ontario, you're getting the station out of Cleveland. Or if you're in Windsor, you're getting Detroit. If you're in Montreal, you're maybe getting the Boston channel. So you get to know those TV stations, and it's kind of funny if you go out, say, to the east, out in Nova Scotia, they're all Red Sox fans, because that was the show that they all got to see, right? So whereas the Blue Jays come along in 77, a lot of people had to switch alliances, and a lot of them didn't.
It was very
knowing a couple of the Tunneys there, I'm shocked that they didn't get the idea that as a gentleman here in the U.S., you got nationwide TV. Why they didn't expand throughout the country of Canada?
Well, it wasn't really feasible, for one thing, to be able to run nationally, because it's a bloody big country. I mean, it's bigger than the U.S. So it's
Don't get hot at us.
Oh, yeah, don't get
No,
mad
I'm
at
just laying
us.
out a
We're just
fact.
asking you questions about your wonderful country with the mooses and the Molsons.
I'm just worried about you coming up here stealing our water. But
Well, wait a minute. Water
Wait a
belongs to the
minute.
indigenous
Wait a
people
minute.
anyway,
Where did
not
that
these
come
white
from?
folks.
Oh my goodness.
I've read a lot of graphic novels and historical potential fiction. That's probably what the U.S. would invade Canada about, would be the water. We have the most fresh water, and well, certainly in the Americas. So we're worried. We're always worried.
You should be.
Good. All right. Back on topic.
It's
But
actually
yeah,
an
it's
excellent point.
impossible to run a national promotion. Even when you look at what Vince did in the 80s, I mean, technology had changed, right? There was so much more flights. You were able to do all that it couldn't have been done in the 70s. When you look at what Eddie Heinhorn tried to do, it was never really a national promotion, right? He ran mainly in the Midwest, and then when Johnny Powers and on all those guys took over, like there was a little bit up in the Northeast, but then Powers is running it, limping along in the Carolinas. So yeah, it just wouldn't have been possible. But I will say that the guys who were on television, they became bigger stars. So that if you're Stu Hart, who started Wildcat Wrestling in what was that, 48, by the
Wow.
time he gets TV, he can then bring in, a Killer Kowalski, a Tiger Jeet Singh, or whoever it is that's been on top in Toronto, and bring them into Calgary, and they have that cachet, right? They've been on TV. Everybody knows who they are.
So did it, the Canadian television, Whipper Billy Watson, did it work both ways? I mean, was he becoming a bigger star in the United States as well because of the Canadian television, or was U.S. stars becoming bigger stars in Canada because you have so much of the population that gets U.S. television?
You know what? I'm not sure there's a lot of that overlap. There's not as much overlap as we might think there would be with the wrestling, simply because wrestling was never on consistently. Let's say you're in, London, Ontario, that Cleveland station may not have wrestling on, right? Because there wasn't a national promotion until we get WWF. But if you jump ahead a little bit to the 80s, yeah, all of a sudden we're getting WWF on the Buffalo station before we actually had WWF running in Toronto. So there is that little overlap, and you're curious about some of these wrestlers. The perfect example is ECW. Many years later, like you'd have to stay up really late at night to watch it on like a UHF channel in Buffalo, and you could watch it there, but you couldn't get it on any Canadian station at all.
So the Whipper Billy Watson Gorgeous George match, the hair match, what year was that? Because George only did 2 hair matches, right? He did that hair match, and then he did one right at the end of his retirement back at the Coliseum when he was kind of in need of a little bit of money.
Yeah, I think it was 56, but it was a really big deal. I mean, it shows a lot the respect that Whipper had, but also the payday they got in Toronto, right? Because this was a good city, and they'd come up here, and notoriously the Tunneys always looked out for talent. So they had there's often been stories told, and you don't hear this about a lot of promoters, right? There'd be a bathtub full of beer, and then there'd be like a spread of sandwiches and stuff after the matches.
They kept that tradition alive even in the 80s when I was coming up there.
And that was a rarity, wasn't it? That did not happen.
Yeah, very, very much so. St. Louis was probably the closest to it, where they had a refrigerator full of Busch beer, Bud beer.
Well, and that's a great comparison because, again, I don't know how many points they all had, but there's absolute truth. There's Sam Muchnick owned part of Toronto, and I'm sure Tunney and probably Whipper owned points down in St. Louis as well. So they not only shared talent, but if you look at when Thez dropped the belt, to Whipper Billy Watson, Thez, of course, is so tied in with Sam Muchnick there in St. Louis. So we dropped the belt to Whipper and then reclaims it in St. Louis. And later when Thez says he's done for a bit and he wants to drop it to Dick Hutton, they do it in Toronto. So there's a connection there that often doesn't get talked about between those two cities, which are quite far apart, and they don't really have a lot else in common. So
I always wondered until I got your great note. I did not know that Tunney or Watson had points in St. Louis, or that Sam had points in Toronto. There, do you know how that came about?
No, I'm pretty sure it's just friendship through the years,
Just
right?
friendship.
I mean, yeah. Well,
wanting to swap talent, right?
Well, but that's what a political player does, right? And Frank Tunney was a great political player. If you look at all those NWA conventions, he's always there in the pictures. He was a big guy, never a wrestler himself, but you know, he's always happily there smoking his cigar in all those NWA convention pictures. So he was obviously a player in however some of these decisions were made.
Do you think he was a player because of Maple Leaf Gardens, or the fact that he had national TV?
Well, by the 60s and into this, well, 60s and 70s, there's no more national TV, right?
Okay.
Everything had sort of splintered off. It doesn't mean that the Maple Leaf Wrestling show wasn't picked up by random stations, but it wasn't anything national anymore. It wasn't on the CBC. And we didn't have another national station till CTV came along in the late 60s, I think it was.
Wow.
So, and for a while, they showed the All-Star Wrestling out of British Columbia, of all things. So you had Al Tomko's promotion on a national basis, and it was the cheesiest looking wrestling you'd ever seen compared to what we'd seen with Maple Leaf Garden. So it made for a real weird, you know, dichotomy. It's like, what is this thing? What am I watching? You know, who's this lobster man, Bruiser Costa?
Hey, Greg, that's an excellent point, because territories are people that didn't work them or have not written about them or read about them or saw them as fans, don't realize how different they were. You know, Memphis was completely different from Texas, completely different from Florida, completely different from Vern. How were the territories different in Canada?
Well, just as simple as you left Toronto and they called it the bullshit circuit. It was a guy named Joe Mach out of Brantford, which is about an hour and a half from Toronto. And so he would run a lot of the smaller towns. And so the guys would get experience working on them, but they wouldn't get much money. And so, but it's a place to work. If you start looking at matches in the 40s and then the 50s, there's weird competition, right? Like one promoter will be in town for a little while, then they'll leave, and then somebody will come in with lightweight guys, completely different style of wrestling, and they'll work there for a few months and realize it wasn't going to work, and then they stop for the winter because hockey comes in. So you had this consistency to things, but certainly out east in the Maritimes, they had a different style. They were looking for, you know, your Cormiers on top, your Leo Burks, those kind of guys were their heroes. In Quebec, very different yet again. Out in Stampede, it was much wilder. They were looking for a lot more blood and guts. Vancouver was a little bit more stayed in a while, I think, in a way that you had the bigger stars out there that just lived out there, right? Your Don Lito Jonathans. If he's established there and Jeet Kiniski both live out there, those are big guys to build around. And they may not be there the whole time, but it sets a different tone for your territory than when the guys are coming and going a lot more like they were out east. Like Harley Race loved to go out east, and he would do a week tour out in Nova Scotia as world champion just to go for the fishing, the seafood, and the beautiful views and the short drives. It was a vacation, right? And then you're back on the road and you have to go to, you know, Topeka. Like it's just a whole different world.
What's wrong with Topeka, Greg?
Nothing. I was just throwing that one out there. I could have said
lost
too. It
every
doesn't matter,
fan
right?
we have in Topeka. Every
Yeah,
fan.
you mentioned Bradford, Canada. How many times did these guys work, and was the money pretty decent for the guys where they could kind of stay around and make a living?
If you work in Toronto, yeah. So in the 50s and into the 60s, the Tunneys had set up a bit of a circuit, right? So you'd work Toronto, there'd be London, Ontario, which is about 2 hours away. Kitchener's about an hour away. You'd sometimes work out east in Oshawa, which is about an hour away. Whoever it was locally up in, I think Gorman, I think was the last name, but in Ottawa. So Ottawa's about 5 hours away. The national capital. So, but they were tied in with the Tunneys as well. So he would be sending guys up there to work. They would stop in Kingston on the way. So there was a circuit. It wasn't as established as, you know, when you look at say the Nashville territory, right? It was like this night is this night is that, this night is that. It wasn't quite like that. There's a lot more variety that goes on when you look at these patterns in Toronto-based wrestling. But I blame hockey partly on that. It was harder to get the arenas in a lot of cases.
Right.
Well, now
it was the same here. Same here when I started doing promotion for events. Basketball had really started growing. The NBA had their expansion, and you go in and ask for dates. I mean, it was impossible. You had to work around the basketball dates and all that. I guess it was the same with hockey when the hockey was hot up there.
Well, and the first ever NBA game was in Toronto. the Toronto
Right.
Huskies, right, in 1948. And so then that team didn't, or sorry, 46.
Great
And then,
piece of trivia.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that
The
they
first
did.
Did you
ever
know that,
first ever
John?
NBA game was in Toronto.
Yes, it was. And of course, basketball was invented by a Canadian too, James Naismith.
But he did it in America, though.
He did, yeah, down in Springfield, yeah.
But it's got to be easier now because now all the hockey's in Florida, isn't it, Mr. Brisco?
Yes. Oh, that's where the Stanley Cup resides now.
It's
Yeah,
just
I
it's
got
like
a house right down the street there on the lake. Got its own lake house and everything.
the Stanley Cup has its own lake house in Florida.
Yeah, it sure does.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, you know those birds that come around all the time?
Yeah,
They told me they were drinking out of the Stanley Cup the other night.
you're kidding me.
No.
I had no idea. I knew Florida.
Well,
was
now
big.
you know. Now you know.
I knew hockey was big in Florida. I knew. I think you invented it there.
Hey, what a great sport you get a bunch of rednecks that's sick and throw a damn piece of rubber on the ground.
Right.
They're going to change the hell out. Then they're going to end up beating the hell out of each of those sticks.
That's right.
But that's another whole topic right there, is all the tie-ins between hockey and wrestling, right? You had like the Crockett's win the Charlotte team for a while.
Yeah.
There was a player in the 1930s named what's his name? Jean Pousset. You can take that however you want, but he was played for the Montreal Canadiens, a bit of a goon, and he ended up being a wrestler as well. So there's a number of those tie-ins, just not as many.
Was
as you get.
Robert the same one? He a big hockey star too?
No,
he
was not, but he was tied in for sure. And then, but Johnny Rougeau, who was the father of, or sorry, the uncle of Jacques and Raymond Rougeau, he ended up being the president of the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League. So there's a lot of back and forth between hockey and wrestling for sure.
Jerry,
Ron Fuller started his own league down in Tennessee.
There you go, yeah.
And did great with it. He's the one that brought a lot of hockey into the South. Fuller did a wonderful job. It's a wonderful story what Fuller did with the hockey there. It's just fantastic.
And again, a lot of these guys owned they had so many connections into the actual arena, right? And in the end, we talked about how tough it was to book the arenas. So Paul Vachon always told a story about when he was starting up Grand Prix Wrestling in Montreal, he couldn't get into the Montreal Forum, right? Which is the cathedral of hockey, right? He wanted to promote there, but Jacques Rougeau controlled it. One time, Butcher's on a flight with Jean Beliveau, one of the greatest hockey players of all time. He starts talking to Beliveau about this problem. Beliveau worked for the Montreal Canadiens, and he just basically went in and said, okay, give this guy the Forum. So that's how they got the Forum in 1972. There's your hockey connection, right? It's
you never know who you're going to meet on an airplane, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I was just sorry, I digress. I'm thinking about airplane flights now. Is that you one in Europe, Mr. Brisco, that we almost didn't get to go any further. So when you say you never know who you're going to meet. Hey, tell me about Don Leo Jonathan. You mentioned him earlier. He was such a big name, such a great star. Did he do much in Toronto?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, he was he worked everywhere. I mean, we call him an honorary Canadian because he ended up living in Vancouver. Though he was born in I remember I saw him once at the CAC, Cauliflower Alley Club, and I said, "Oh, I just drove through your town of Hurricane, Utah." And he's like, "Well, actually, I was born in a little town just outside of Hurricane, Utah." And as you know, Gerald, he had the greatest voice. No, you would not have expected this voice out of this giant of a man. But yeah, for sure, he used television. And his dad, brother Jonathan, actually wrestled up here too for a while. In fact, you can see that a lot too. Like there's Warren Bachwinkle worked up here, and then he sent Nick up here when he was really young to work as well. So there's a lot of those connections. I think it's partly because Tunney treated everybody so well. But Don Leo for sure was a huge star here. He had that charisma, right? He had that magnetism. When he was on the air and when he was fighting a guy like Killer Kowalski, or he's taking on somebody like Whipper Billy, like those were believable matches, right? Those are two guys that are matched up truly as giants. And Whipper was not that big of a guy, but he was that big of a personality.
Yeah, he's a huge personality.
You were talking about the other territories. How would you define the wrestling from Toronto?
Well, it was pretty. So I think in Toronto they controlled it a little bit more. If you, as in it was mainly in the ring. They ended up having to build the ramp, which became a big part of Toronto lore. It
Yeah.
was a ramp to get to the ring because they had a guy named Nanjo Singh that created so many riots, and the fans got so mad at him that they created a ramp so you couldn't stab him on the way into the ring.
Yeah.
And it ended up, I mean, WWF continued to
Well,
use
so
it,
many
right?
Boston recreated that ramp. John, did you ever walk the ramp in Boston?
I
Rose
did.
Gardens?
Sure did. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well,
The
that's where it
worst-
came from.
Yeah, I digress, but the worst was the Cow Palace in San Francisco. You had the fans would, sit right over you, around when where the heels would walk out. So you'd have to do the double take. You do the fake entrance, and shit would just rain down from the ceiling, trying to get throw it on you. And as soon as they go to reload, then you take off. Those entrances that used to be, especially for heels, that ramp made a big difference because it was a tough way to get in and out of the ring, especially if you left a babyface laying.
One of the things you'll see a lot when you see the Toronto pictures are the ushers at Maple Leaf Gardens, right? They always had the nice jackets and the hats, whereas in a lot of places it's just some random security guys. So they stand out a little bit. But I guess my point is in Toronto they had the ramp, but then if they run in London or Kitchener or whatever, you often had a little bit more wildness because the crowds had more access to the wrestlers, right? They can show their true passion. And there was a little bit more, maybe not rioting, because there are some cases of that in Toronto and just about anywhere, but they just were able to let loose a little bit more.
And
And
who
Do
was
you recall? You recall? I mean, you mentioned the gentleman that had all the heat there. Was that a pretty common thing for Toronto wrestling? With getting heat? Was there any really big gigantic riots that the people that we can't allow this or?
not gigantic, but so Nanjo Singh was this fascinating story, and Steve
Right.
Johnson, my often co-writer, as you guys both know, he's working on a piece that'll be in a future book about Nanjo because he became a huge star here in Toronto. And fighting Whipper. I mean, he was a great nemesis for Whipper in the late 40s. And then he ends up killing his wife down in Philadelphia, does prison time, and then he comes back later and is back in the ring wrestling. So, which you don't hear a lot about.
No.
So, it's sort of fascinating like that. Other guys like Bulldog Brower were able to get a lot of heat. I always loved him, and when we were doing I just knew I always wanted a book with Bulldog Brower on the cover because he had those eyes, right?
Right.
He had great big giant eyes that would just bug out. And so he's on the cover of our Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, The Heels, where he's beating up Carlos Belafonte, who everybody knows better as Test. You guys know who he became? Carlos Belafonte.
No. John, come on, John.
Carlos Colon. So he came up
wow.
here.
Really? Carlos Belafonte. I had no idea.
Yeah, so 71, 72, he's up here. And again, all the promoters sort of would work together a little bit. So Belafonte is working around Southern Ontario. A lot of it's for the Bearman, Dave McKigney, who we haven't talked about yet. He'd be out in the Maritimes, or he'd be out in Calgary and learn stuff there. So there was an opportunity for these guys to hopscotch a little bit and go territory to territory.
I want to go back to Dick Hutton. He dropped the title there. Was Dick over better in Toronto than he was? Because he didn't, he was the NWA champion and a hell of a shooter wrestler, but he didn't have the personality, it seemed like, to get over in the States. Or was he a pretty big star up in Toronto?
Well, from what I can tell, they certainly ran a couple of big angles up here, right? He did I can't remember what it was, $10,000 or about $1,000. It was a lot of money back
to his chest, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The challenge, and that got over pretty well here. It was written about often in the newspapers. But as I alluded to earlier, is that Tunney had these guys that worked at the newspapers who were writing these very favorable pieces, right? And whether they're truly on the payroll or whether the newspaper just sort of, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, will let you write these things. So there was a lot more of that kind of publicity in the Toronto newspapers than you find in a lot of other places, right? It's like it's strange that way. And that continued on many years later with the Toronto Sun. When I was working there, the greatest newspaper, like sales-wise, they ever had was WrestleMania 6, like the day after. That they sold more newspapers that day ever until the Blue Jays won the World Series a couple years later.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
You know what I find amazing too, that you guys have that great website up there, Facebook page at Maple Leaf Wrestling, and they showed some newspaper clippings from, I believe it was the 50s or something like that, where they had results from all over the world, basically, especially all over the United States. Or was that a common thing? And like you said, Tunney had to be taking care of the newspaper writers.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's all that kind of stuff. There were usually results in the papers, but there may not always be write-ups, but there's almost always results.
Hmm.
And Toronto still has, uh, 4 newspapers. Like, it's insane, really, to think about it. Like, you got the Toronto Star, the Toronto Sun, the Globe and Mail, and the National Post. We still have 4 newspapers in this town. Now, they're not all going to cover the same thing, but back in the day, they would all at least have to have the results of the wrestling because there was competition between them all. Yeah, so it's fascinating the way the journalism happens like that, but yet there wasn't a lot of radio stuff on there. Like when I talked to Bill Mercer and for our storytellers book, and Bill Mercer telling stories about calling wrestling on the radio down in Oklahoma. Like it was a different time, right? 1939.
Mercer was a great announcer.
He was. I mean, he knew his role, but he ties into baseball. If we go back to that, right? Because he worked with the Texas Rangers forever. He covered, was it SMU football? He did a ton of stuff over the years. So that brings a different gravitas to the announcer, I think, when he comes in there. So he's not just a wrestling announcer.
That's got to be the biggest word we've ever had on this podcast.
Yeah, by far. That's the biggest word.
I believe it's origins.
Once again, it goes back to the educational fact of our podcaster.
That's right.
Do I need to talk slower for you guys?
Yeah, for me, for John, especially from Texas.
Guys that called baseball were different guys because it's not like football. A lot of times there's no action in baseball. So, and I'm a baseball fan. I love baseball. I listened to the radio growing up. Now I watch on TV, but you calling baseball on the radio is tough. You got to be able to tell stories. So that translates well into wrestling. Whereas, calling football is you're doing something all the time. It's different mindset.
Yeah, that's a really good comparison. And hockey's the same thing. Like it never stops, right? So there's not a lot of time to tell those little anecdotes. Whereas baseball, there's nothing but time.
Right, and you guys, good announcers make such a difference. There's a guy, I can't think of his name, from Baltimore, and he is so good. He's just fun. It's like old Dandy Don. Every once in a while you get an announcer like a Charles Barkley or something that's just fun to listen to, and those guys make all the difference in a show, just as they did in wrestling. Who were the main wrestling announcers back when television started?
Well, if you look at the early days of CBC, you would bring in those guys that were national, like your Ward Cornells. I don't actually know a ton of the guys because they didn't become personalities in the sense that there weren't your Ed Whalen kind of guy that's out there out front doing all the interviews. When you look, because not a lot of those tapes still exist either from the Maple Leaf Wrestling stuff. It's really a shame. And then when you get to the 70s, they're taping in Hamilton, Ontario at the Telecenter, which was just outside it's a CHCH building. And so they would tape Maple Leaf Wrestling there. And there would be different guys that would come in. It was Mike McMahon was one. But the color commentators are often the ones we remember. And that was often Billy Red Lyons, who was involved in the promotion as well with Tunney. But he was the one doing all the announcing. And that continued on when out of the blue, after Frank Tunney died, Jack Tunney, who was his nephew, took over the company and made a deal with WWF to bring WWF into town. And he was loyal to Billy Red Lyons, and Billy Red got to do all the announcing, right? He was the guy, don't you dare miss it, doing all those interviews like your Mean Gene role for national TV. And the important thing is you couldn't run, say, WWF Superstars in Canada. They had to have a Toronto office at the time because you had to have different advertising on the program than the US station. So that's primarily why the Toronto office existed for many years. As you know, the Great Gorilla of the North, right? That was your Carl DeMarco there. They were mainly there to sell advertising and make different deals in the arenas that they couldn't bring in just whole hog everything from the US.
You mentioned big time heel Tiger Jeet Singh. I know I'm jumping all over the map, but Tiger Jeet
All
Singh
right.
became a huge name in Japan. Was his start there in Toronto, and did he develop the name bigger in Japan, or was he first a big star there in Toronto?
Ooh, okay. Well, we'll try to say this. We're not going to hurt Tiger's feelings. He was learning a lot. He was learning a lot in Toronto. If you look at the early results, this and that, he was definitely way down on the card, right? And he was trained by Fred Atkins, and Fred Atkins was one of the referees often in Toronto because his career had sort of wound down by that point. And he was like the slowest referee ever. If you ever see any of the things, he's like when he finally gets down, it's the Bronco Lubitsch thing.
And Bronco Lubitsch, that's exactly where I was going.
Just so slow.
Bronco would actually curse you if you did very many false finishes. He would actually tell you to stop because seriously, he would. He goes, guys, I'm not getting down again. I'm not. And it's Bronco, so you don't do it. You go,
That's
okay.
where the old foot tap came in.
Yeah.
But so yeah, Tiger got better, and I think going to Japan helped him really develop his career and his personality. But the thing is, we had the Sheik here. So Ed Farhat, the Sheik, the Toronto office was in a downturn in the early 70s. So they made a deal to bring in the Sheik as the booker in Toronto. And so he starts bringing in his own guys, but he also recognizes, especially at that point in the late 60s and early 70s, that Toronto had changed big time. And it was very, very multicultural. And now you can't walk down the street without hearing at least 2 different languages, and probably many more in big parts of Toronto. It's a fascinating multicultural melting pot. But Toronto became like that. So you can have a guy like Carlos Rocha came in, who was a huge Portuguese star, and he headlined massive gates at Toronto at Maple Leaf Gardens, but meant nothing anywhere else in the world. So Tiger Jeet got to that point too, right? Where he would finally became a big enough star that he would bring in all the East Asians that lived out in Toronto, and they'd come in to support their local guy. And when you look at the smaller promotions, the little independents that would run around Toronto, they almost always had a Singh or something like that just to try to capitalize on his name. And obviously Singh's a very common name as well, but there's a big part of it there too. And so he got a lot better. But then when Tiger started doing so much stuff in Japan, he meant nothing here. Like, it's really funny because when you look in the 80s, Tiger Jeet's not here at all. He's making all his money in Japan. He'll maybe do a couple of shows here and there. Once he would promote, he really wouldn't go back to work for Tunney once he was a big star. He really wanted to be the guy on top, right? But what he did was he would run tours. Let's say Trinidad and Tobago was one of the places he would run shows. So he would bring all his friends from Hamilton and Toronto and bring them down and promote them on the shows. Silent Brian McNee.
Don't mention Hamilton.
Oh, okay, but I was going to bring Silent Brian because you have a story about him, I believe, John. So he was a guy that would go to all these places because of Tiger. So Tiger, again, going back to, Tunney looked out for his people he cared about. Tiger did the same thing. So he would bring his guys to Japan or Trinidad or wherever it was. Are you allowed to tell your Silent Brian story?
Which one?
He was in Japan, didn't you?
He was in Japan. Yeah, he was in Japan. It was actually fun being with him because I learned the greatest curse word ever in sign language. He would look at me and he'd point and he'd go, "You," and he'd go, bullshit, because he's deaf, so he didn't. So he'd do that, and it was the bull. He'd tell me I was bullshit, but then when he wanted to scream at me,
boy, he knew you well.
He knew me very well. When he wanted to scream at me, he would point at me like this, and he'd do it with his whole body. He'd do it. Yeah. It was great. That was his screaming bullshit at me.
That's awesome. But it just speaks, there's so many of those little guys that never get talked about, right? In pro wrestling in general, right? We can talk about all the guys that headline Maple Leaf Gardens, but there's those guys who are on the undercard, right? That are there week after month, going to these shows. Your Bobby Bass, your Tim Gerards. These guys aren't necessarily big stars, but they tell great stories, right? Like, that's often what it is. For every superstar out there, it's what we found doing all these different books and stuff at slamwrestling.net was that often it's the lesser names that tell better stories, partly because they remember them better. Right. Their ego hasn't been so corrupted by stardom that they believe their own stories. Roddy Piper was the worst of that.
Oh,
But that
no
kind of,
kidding.
yeah,
Rodder's horrible.
exactly. I called him on it once. It's like, Roddy, why do you keep saying your first match was 16 seconds, Winnipeg Arena, against Larry Henning? You'd already been wrestling 2 years by that point. And he would just sort of looked at me and glared. So it's like, okay, I'll drop it. But
And what
I
was
did
he
call him
ranked
on it.
in? What was he ranked in your book and your ratings?
Oh, I'd have to look it up again. I think he's
Did you have
9.
Jeet Singh ahead of Brett?
No, Tiger Jeet was not ahead of Red. He was not in our top 20, my top 20. So this book was all me. Though I did talk to a whole bunch of historians back then and tried to get a good, balance and this and that. But again, in the end, it's one guy's book, one guy's opinion. Is it true? People will complain about the tag team books. People will complain about, the heels book. But
Did you
when we
have
talk,
I
Scott?
love
Did
the
you have?
Hills book, by the way.
Did
John,
you
you
have?
need to read the Hills book. I've read that. That's a great book.
It
by
is
the
a
way,
great
Greg.
book. Very good book.
he's in it.
Did you have Skylo low ahead of Brett?
So what I did was 8 and 8.5 were Sky Lolo and Little Beaver. So it was a gimmick, yes. But who else ever performed for the Queen of England? No other wrestlers. But
Good
they did.
point. Good point there.
Let's talk about what makes a star, right? If you're a Canadian and you're performing for the Queen, who is still to this day the King of England, is our monarch, is the person in charge of our government, even though they really don't have any direct role. Like, to me, that lifts them up a little bit. I don't think I was courting controversy, but obviously that happened out of it, and you just roll with it. And I'm over it. I'd never had a problem with Brett, so Brett's had a problem with me, and that's okay.
Lord Alfred Hayes had the deal with the king, right, or the prince, where you're not supposed to shake his hand. And William Regal told a story on our podcast one time. And Lord Alfred Hayes, as the king was coming around, he steps forward and shakes the hand and has a cameraman taking the picture. And that's how he got booked in America, was saying, I'm friends with the king and I got this award and all this stuff. So heaven forbid that a wrestler would actually manufacture something.
Well, hard to believe. Yeah, no, exactly. It's just so odd that they would do anything like that. But that's working the media, right? That's learning.
Oh, of course it is.
Right,
yeah. Of course it is.
So
Hey,
it's
Greg, and pre WWE days in Toronto, what would you, in your estimation, your research, say the biggest all time angle before WWE stepped in was
the one key turning point in wrestling history happened in Toronto, right? It was 63. What was it? January 24th, I think. So Lou Thez against Buddy Rogers. Nature Boy Buddy Rogers is the NWA World Champion. Thez beats him in Toronto, but it's only one fall. All the NWA promoters recognize him as the new champion because I don't think they really all trusted Buddy Rogers at that point. But that's the point where Vince McMahon Sr. says, I don't recognize this. I'm going to break away, and Nature Boy is my champion. And so that's a key turning point in the history of wrestling. There'd be no WWE today if Vince McMahon hadn't gone off on his own.
Right.
Did he always plan on going off on his own, and that was his excuse?
I think so. I think to some degree, yeah. Because Vern Gagne did something similar, right? Like, he just decided to start recognizing his own champion, and that had always happened. You'll go back to the days of your Dean Dettons and all these different kind of champions, and you're trying to figure out what the lineage is. Well, it doesn't always make sense because, Steve Casey was the world champion out here in Boston, but, here we had, what's the name? Anyways, you get my point though, right? They're jumping all around. Right. And so I was going to say though, the other part that is important to mention is Bruno. Right, Bruno Sammartino worked for Vince and then had a falling out and left and became who we came to know him as in Toronto. Right, there was a huge Italian population, right, and still is. And so he became a hero to the local community, and he loved his time in Toronto. When they came up here, was that 2012? They did a WrestleCon up here in Toronto, and Bruno told me specifically that make sure I bring out Sweet Daddy Siki and the Wolfman Willie Farkas for him to see again. And that's how much these guys still meant to him, like 40 years later, because he just really fell in love with Toronto. Of course, it wasn't that far from Pittsburgh, which I think helped a lot.
Right.
But that gave him the confidence then to be able to go back And when he became the Bruno Sammartino, we all knew, internationally.
But that saved his career too, right? I mean, after the falling out he had with Vince Sr., he really had almost nowhere to go, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and Tunney was one of the few that took a chance on him because it's an informal blackballing, isn't it? Right? Like your promoters are talking to each other, but in the end, green is what matters, and it or our different colored money up here, which wasn't the case then. But now, like Tunney sees, okay, this guy can make money. I have a huge, Italian population. Why wouldn't I bring him in?
And I think the allegation was that the allegation was always against these old promoters with that Vince McMahon Sr. booked him somewhere that Bruno claims he didn't know he was booked. Bruno no shows. Vince McMahon Sr. turns him into the commission, and that gets him banned from several different places, and he has a hard time finding work, and finally ended up in Toronto because it was almost the last resort, right?
Well, and I guess maybe at some level, whatever Canadian authorities aren't going to recognize that U.S. rule anyway, right? If they're all, all the different states are trying to band together and agree on something, which never happens anyway. But
we all know how honest our athletic commissions are here in the United States.
Yeah.
It was the same up here, not any different.
Was it? You mentioned earlier Killer Kowalski. I mean, he was such an international star, and his how do you compare his run with Bruno Sammartino's run?
Well, they certainly worked a few times. That's no doubt the case. But they were just different wrestlers, right? In fact, when I look at Killer, there's two different Killer Kowalskis. If you look at the Killer Kowalski before his car accident, right, he was a very different wrestler, right? He was a lot more active, all that kind of stuff. And then he had the car accident, and his body shape changed a little bit. He changed his eating habits.
His body changed tremendously during that time.
And so he became a different wrestler, and he's the one that we sort of think of more recently, because that's the guy we saw that was, looming large and doing all that stuff when he was opening the wrestling school. And he got so much publicity out of that wrestling school that because it was really the first wrestling school that got any sort of national attention, right? So that's the Killer Kowalski we all think of. But yeah, if that guy in the 50s and the 60s, if you brought him into today, he could still be a headliner. And you can't say that about a lot of those guys. Like a Dick Hutton, like we talked about, I'm not sure he would translate. I don't think Whipper would. But Killer Kowalski, Don Leo Jonathan, Kiniski, I think any of those guys could be top stars today.
One of the guys that I want to bring up here while we got time is that guy that's forgotten a lot in the history of our business. And to me, he was one of the most striking personalities ever. And that's Sweet Daddy Siki. Was he trained? Was he a local guy, or what was his story?
Oh, I love Sweet Daddy. So I worked
I do too. And I was he was one of my childhood heroes when I was growing up.
So he's actually from Texas.
God bless Texas.
No, I can't have a childhood hero from Texas. Greg, come on.
Mr. Brisco, you are from a fine man.
But he moved to LA when he was like 12, I think it was. And
Good.
so there when he was raised by an aunt and uncle, and that's where he learned to box, and that's where he learned to wrestle. Sandor Szabo was one of the guys that helped train him. Wow. One of the fun things of my job is going to these events and getting to meet guys. So Father Bill Olivas, right, who was Elephant Boy, was one of those guys that worked those very early shows in the 50s in Arizona with Sweet Daddy Siki. And Bob Ellis was one of the other young guys coming up there too. And so to be able to put them all in touch again after losing touch is one of the, the little blessings I get out of this gig. But yeah, Sweet Daddy went to New York. He was a headliner there, right? He was a big star just about everywhere he went. Then he married a white woman. And so he stopped getting booked. And so he ended up in Toronto, where, his wife had some ties as well. So he and Ann moved up here, and that was not really an issue. So all of a sudden he was able to continue to work here. He settled in Toronto. He became part of the furniture, basically. I mean, everybody who lives in the west end of Toronto, which is where I am, has stories about seeing him driving his hearse. He had a purple hearse.
That's a famous story about that, yeah.
Exactly. And then he had a band, so he would be out singing country music.
He was a fantastic country and western singer, correct?
He was, yeah, and he loved Merle Haggard especially. He loved to do
Yeah,
the
yeah,
old.
exactly. I always heard,
Uh,
that he became Big Al Downing. It was a big country star here in the States because Al Downing. Did you know who I'm talking about there?
no, I don't know
Country.
that one as much,
He
and I'm
bleached his
actually.
hair. He's Afro American, of course. He bleached. He looked. He had the same persona, the bleached hair as Sweet Daddy Siki.
So the country music story with Sweet Daddy Siki, though, is when we worked on the documentary, I saw that Charlie Pride was coming
Right.
to Southern Ontario, and I didn't set it up, but it was my idea. The producer of the documentary managed to talk to Charlie Pride's people, and so Sweet Daddy Siki and his son went down to meet Charlie Pride in Windsor, Ontario, and there's this magic part of the documentary where they're on screen together just singing. Charlie
Yeah.
Pride and Sweet, just impromptu in the
Yeah.
hotel room. But they talked a lot about the camaraderie that existed between not just traveling musicians and wrestlers, but in that case, it was also Black musicians and
Right.
wrestlers because there were only so many places they could stay, right?
Yeah.
So they had met along the way, right? So Siki had met Ali because there was only so many different places to stay, all those kind of things. And so they had this brotherhood and sisterhood that maybe the white guys didn't have. But Siki continues to live up here. He's not doing really well. He has some memory issues, which is pretty common for pro wrestling. But man, he was a great guy.
Who are we talking about?
Sweet Daddy still. Sweet Daddy.
Well played. Well played, Mr. Brisco. You mentioned the diversity of Toronto. That's really interesting. Your mate Steve Johnson. I read his book. I'm honored to write the foreword for it. Just an incredible story of Jim Londos. During the time of Jim Crow laws and segregation and the Klan, Jim Londos was a Greek immigrant that was the biggest draw in America during the Depression. I mean, it's just an incredible story. But wrestling was really behind. Well, society was really behind here, but it seems like it wasn't in Toronto.
Well, Londos came up here quite often too, and he was a big star here. But I think Toronto's always been a little bit more open. I can't say it's perfect by any means. We used to have a lot of the orange parades, and all the Italian or all the Irish, would fight with the Protestants and the Catholics, and we had some of that going on over the years. There was a riot over the Jews in 1933, before World War II. So there's been issues through the years, but I think wrestling as a whole has always been a place to go hang out and drop some of that stuff and just, bond together and celebrate it. It's the same as the Leafs, right? As bad as they may have been lately, at least you go to the hockey game, you can forget about all these other things and enjoy this together as a unique togetherness experience.
You probably have that with hockey now that it's based out of Florida, don't you, Mr. Brisco?
Yeah, all the time. Yeah, we accept Canadians down there and the Canadian dollar down there. We accept that. We always at Brisco Brothers Body Shop. We always welcome Canucks.
Well, there you go. Good
But
business.
When Bruno came to the Gardens, he was, like I say, we were talking about, he was kind of a last resort type thing. A lot of things he did also was because he could have been the world's strongest man at the time. He did a lot of strength lifting and things like powerlifting and set records. That was a part of what made Bruno, not just the wrestling, but Bruno really worked hard on making himself this great character, right?
Absolutely. It's not just his look, but his humility, right? So he would be going out to the Italian parts of town and hanging out and having a latte at these places. Or there was an Italian still an Italian newspaper in the town. So, they'd be writing about him as their great hero. So he knew also how to cultivate it, but you're building a loyal following at the same time, right? So that guy who just came will bring the next guy out, and I just met this guy at the coffee shop. You give him a pair of tickets, and he becomes a fan. There's a real bit of steamroll, just everything keeps rolling, right? And Bruno was brilliant at that. Even as simple as he knew names, right? So he would meet you, and he would remember your name, right? And for a geek like me, to Bruno to remember my name was like one of the highlights of my wrestling life.
Yeah, the humility of Bruno. I got to interview him a couple years before he passed away. One of the thrills of my life, and we cut for something about halfway in because it was an edited show, and to put the clips in. And he said, "Are my answers okay?" You're Bruno Sammartino. You can do whatever you want. I'm worried about my questions, not your answers, pal. he just has that legend status around him. When he walks in, you realize that guy is something special. Did the match with Rogers? I've asked several people, and most have. I'll give you the question without any preface to it. Was it a shoot?
No, I don't think so.
Because Bruno told me that it was a shoot, that they brought Rogers in and they gimmicked the commission to get him cleared because he had some type of heart issue. There people debate, Bruno was debating whether it was legit or not. I think it was. But then when Bruno got out there, Bruno said, grab your best hold. And that's why it lasted so long. So it was such a short match and why there wasn't much to it. That's Bruno's story. I'm just telling you, that's why I'm asking.
But it's not like Rogers was naive either, right? So he's going to go along with it, which to me means it's not a shoot, it's a work in the sense that he knew best to go along with it, right?
Yeah.
So
there was no way that Rogers was going to compete with Bruno Sammartino in strength.
I guess that I used the wrong terminology. It was a shoot. It was a shoot as far as Bruno saying, I'm going to take the title off of you, but I guess screw job would be better. But my point is, was Bruno off script on this thing and taking the title off of him? Because Bruno claimed that Rogers came in and was guaranteed that nothing was going to happen. He was going to keep the title. Bruno says when he got into the ring, he'd already made arrangements with everybody that this was what was going to happen. It wasn't Bruno going rogue. It was the powers that be were in agreement with this, that Bruno said, I'm going to take the title off of you today.
Right. So they're in cahoots kind of thing. And then Rogers was left out of the loop. That probably, of everything that makes the most sense, that would be it. But like I said, you definitely shoot is the wrong word because he didn't fight for his life. Right?
No, he didn't. He
back and forth
realized,
like,
he realized,
I give up.
Not much you can do in 36 seconds or whatever.
48, I think. Yeah, 48 seconds, yes.
Because Bruno said he didn't turn his back. Bruno used to always turn his back after, the introduction. Bruno said he didn't turn his back. He backed up because he just told him that he was going to take the title off him. He didn't want to get cheap shotted, is what he said.
That's what makes wrestling so fascinating, though, right? Is we keep going back to these things again and again. We never get the true answers, and that's part of the fun.
Yeah, not that anybody's ever been involved in a big time screw job or anything up in Canada.
Well, Don Eagle, was he a Toronto guy?
No, he was from the Kananakwe Reserve, just outside of Montreal. So he was legit Mohawk, and his father, of course, was a wrestler as well, a War Eagle. And so he didn't do he's not really on the cards a lot in Toronto. I mean, there's a few here and there, but he really did try to make his bones down the U.S. And in 1950,
was he a bigger star in the U.S. than what you said?
I think so. It was partly that whole, Indigenous promotion thing, right? Just trying to celebrate this guy, and he's playing a gimmick, right? And the Indigenous people in Canada weren't always celebrated as much as they should be. There wasn't like the Cowboys and Indians culture that the U.S. was so known for, because our West was not settled the same way yours was.
Right.
So there's sort of that, again, a difference in how things changed or through the years. And so it's odd when you think about it. There's not really a ton of guys that were Indigenous that were big stars in Canada. I'm gonna have to think about. I'm gonna probably go to sleep and remember a few. But yeah, it's just,
I don't recall. I've studied them. I don't recall Don Eagle and his father was really the only one I kind of placed.
Yeah, I mean, Billy Two Rivers had some runs in Montreal, but he was from there, and that was partly the ties in the Vachons. But yeah, there's really not too many that were ever on top.
Well, what do you have against the Indians up in Canada?
Good point.
That's a really good question, especially those Briscoes.
If you ever been stretched by many times by the Briscoes as I have, you'd have something against them too.
I only ever met I met Jack a couple of times, but the one time at the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame in upstate New York, it was him and Jan was the second wife, right? They were just sat at the bar and just drank for a couple hours.
Actually, third.
Okay. Yeah, so I really like Jack.
Jack, good guy. From what I hear, nicer guy than me.
All right. Well, while we're talking about world champions, we do need to mention the one more world championship change that happened in Toronto, right? Was when Harley Race beat Terry Funk. That happened in Toronto. And so that's a match that I think probably made the rounds more than any other that people have seen from the heyday of pro wrestling in the 70s in Toronto, right? Because the match was shot sort of from above. You can see the ramp, all that kind of stuff. And then Harley's, you know, of course, Harley and all slow and methodical as he does his stuff. But then to win the title and all that. So I think that's maybe the one match that has been seen the most from Maple Leaf Gardens in the 70s.
You're speaking of that. You mentioned earlier that most of the history is in trash cans, as it is here. Is that kind of the norm there for wrestling TV up there, where they recycled the tape like they did here in the States, and there's very little out there?
The tapes cost as much here as they did there. So yeah, they just reused them, and it's a real shame. There's just not that much around, and you know, it's a bummer for sure. I'd love to know more about some of these things. I'd love to see some of these guys. I'd love to hear them, but a lot of that stuff just doesn't exist.
Well,
they lost about 10 years of Tonight Show with Johnny Carson for the same reason. You know, it happened in all of television. You know, people just didn't realize how valuable the stuff was. You know, that people 50 years from now would want to see all that.
Well, I did one book that wasn't mentioned called Who's the Man, Billy Van. It's about an entertainer named Billy Van who was on Sonny and Cher, who was on Party Game Up Here, The Hilarious House of Frightenstein. He did all these different things through the years that so much of it just doesn't exist. But what we are fortunate to hear that the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, did keep a lot of stuff. So I spent one day sitting there just watching old video that they'd kept. And it was just unbelievable, some of the stuff that existed. So it is good that there is some preservation out there. It's never enough, and it's not necessarily accessible to the public. That's the other thing. So yeah, there are people sitting on wrestling collections that just aren't available to us, right? So we're so spoiled in this world of streaming. We can get whatever we want whenever we want, that one day hopefully we can see all that other stuff.
Speaking of which, this is a little bit of trivia, tidbit of trivia here. You know who is possesses some of the largest collection of Indianapolis wrestling tapes?
No, and I
David Letterman.
Really?
Really?
Because David Letterman did commentary for Indianapolis wrestling for a little bit before he became a huge star, and he was a huge fan, so he collected Indianapolis wrestling tapes. Because I know when WWE was making the move to buy out a lot of these libraries across the countries, I was working with, I can't recall the lady's name up there, but she told me that David Letterman owned most of the existing tapes that were left up there. So somebody from our office contacted his office, and he said they're not for sale. So,
huh? But again, there's a great example of something that's out there that we don't know about, and that's amazing. So, yeah.
How many books have you written, Greg?
I will say 20 that I was directly involved with, that my name's on a cover. But I've edited another good 40 or 50, and so everything from Hockey Hall of Famers Red Kelly and Pierre Pilote, where I edited their books, to, you know, guys like Eric Johnston, whose dad was Bullwhip Danny Johnson, who I think worked with Jerry at some point. So there's all kinds of different levels of books and different kinds of books, and I did a couple of kids' books, including one I wrote with my son about hockey called Duck with the Puck. So I'd like some variety. I guess that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So is there any main thing that we missed in Toronto Maple Leaf history?
No, I would just say that, I mean, it really changes when Tunney sells out of the blue to WWF. I mean, there was no warning.
Did you guys feel that coming as fans?
Nope.
No.
It was very much out of the blue. But
kind of like Atlanta, Georgia.
A little bit, but without the parking lot fights and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I think the difference is that Crockett had points in Toronto for a few years. George Scott had a third. Crockett had a third.
How did that come about? I'm glad you brought that up, and I apologize for messing it. To me, that's important.
It partly comes in because the Sheik ran it into the ground, right? Just like he did Detroit. It just lasted a little bit longer in Detroit. he'd done so much bad booking in Toronto with himself on top and the short matches and the gimmick finishes and all that, that wrestling by 77 was not very big in Toronto anymore. So at that point, somehow George Scott and
Who was a Hamilton guy, by the way, to where
he
allowed
was,
to talk
yeah.
about Hamilton, we could have
Can't talk about
discovered
it.
that.
He's definitely a guy that doesn't get his props as far as history of the business, because he was very key to the early days of WWF, the growth of it. He booked all the stuff down in Charlotte. So at this point, he's the booker in Charlotte. And so he makes a deal with Tunney to use Crockett talent. They all had a third. And so they would fly the guys in from Crockett, and then the underneath guys would be local guys, but the main guys would be on top. And so that was their TV too. So the TV, the same idea, you have to have a slightly different version in Canada. So they would get the tapes out of Charlotte, run some of those matches, and intersperse their own stuff in there to promote the local stuff. But at some point, that just sort of ran its course too. And I think it was partly because Crockett got distracted by everything else going on. So before Starrcade 83, which is sort of one of the turning points in the wrestling business, by that point, Crockett sort of drifted away from working with Toronto. And so Tunney at that point, if you look at some of those cards, they're pretty darn weak.
And when we heard that as talents, that we were really disappointed because guys enjoyed coming to Toronto and working up there.
Yeah,
exactly. We like
so
the sandwiches and the cold beer afterwards.
There you go.
Before the
cards, and then WWF comes in
before the blue checks.
Yeah,
blue check. Oh,
you know, Greg, for those that don't know, we used to get when you worked in Canada, you got a check that was literally written in blue. It was blue ink, but they took out the Canadian taxes, so and the exchange rate was against you. Unlike England, where the exchange rate was in your favor, where you'd make more money. So you get killed on the exchange rate and you get killed on taxes. So we always joked about blue checks in Canada.
All right. I did not know that, but
that's right. They were literally blue checks. They remember Brisco, they're blue ink.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
But of course, the dollar's gone up and down through the years. I mean, when you look at the history of the Canadian Football League, there's all kinds of guys that came north to play in Canada because the dollar was stronger and they got paid better than they did in the NFL, which is impossible to believe now. But it's certainly the case in the 50s and the 60s. Even Joe Theismann started in Toronto. Right. Like the money was just better at a certain point coming out of college to play.
I got an old pal you might reckon, Earthquake Earl Ludford.
I don't think I know that name. No, okay.
He was a leading rusher for Saskatchewan for years, and Jim Dillard. Jim Dillard was another. He was a teammate of mine. I don't know where in Oklahoma State.
He was a big one. Some of his best years up there.
Pardon?
Warren Moon.
Warren Moon, he set every record up there, I think.
He spent some of his best years up there.
And Dwayne Johnson, I mean, he had his best years of football up there.
That's right.
There is a lot of his CFL history. That's another whole story. But yeah, there's guys like George Wells, that played up here and
Walking George,
Yeah, exactly. So it's just all these He's a guy we've never found. We'd love to talk to Jerry. George Wells, where's he? Some of these guys just fall off the map, right?
They do. I love George. So George was a funny guy to travel with too, man. I love George. Walking George, we call him. He didn't walk around like he's out of days all the time. Said it was those Canadian football helmets.
Hey, running into mooses and Molsons up there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Greg, we appreciate your time. We hope you don't hate us after this thing, because we would love your stories and everything. We like to have a good time, as you can tell, on this thing, and so I appreciate it. When I told John was great. I mean, we've been doing a lot of these history shows, and we would be really incomplete if we didn't do something about Toronto and Hamilton, which we'll get to maybe if you'll consent to come back with us one day. We'll do just a show on Hamilton, because there's so many stars. Let's just, if you don't mind, just throw out a few stars, and then we'll get going.
Well, if you look at the list of guys that came out of Hamilton, you had the Sharp brothers, right, who were the first big Gaijin stars in Japan, right? And then Mike Sharp, and then Irons Mike Sharp Jr. is much later. That you had George Scott, Sandy Scott, you had Pepper Martin became, the guy who beat up Superman in Superman 2. Like there's all these guys. There's just so much history that's came out of Hamilton through the years.
John
It's
and
really
Chris told us who two guys that were very influential in my career, by the way.
absolutely. And Tolis was such a huge star. Yeah, there's a lot of those guys and they may not have been Tolis.
And Ivan Koloff, right? Wasn't he out of there too?
He trained in Hamilton.
Oh, he
So
trained.
he was actually from the Ottawa Valley, but he trained in Hamilton because there were a couple of guys there that trained. Dewey Robertson, who was the missing link, Murray Cummings, and Vic Rossitani. Like there were just so many guys that could Billy
What
Red
a great guy Vic was. One of the funniest guys on the road you ever want to meet.
I was in Japan with Dewey, and when it came back, Crockett had just opened up Texas, and so he said, "Hey, talk to Jim for me and see if I can come down there and work." So I went in there and told Mr. Crockett, I said, I ran into Dewey Robertson over in Japan, and Crockett looked at me like he had seen a ghost. I don't know what he did to Crockett, but I called Dewey. I said, Dewey, I don't think it's gonna work. I don't know what happened. I have no idea, but that was a no-go.
So my wife wrote Dewey's book, so his autobiography, and so we got to know Dewey really well. And
It was great. I love Dewey.
Yeah, so one of my fondest, my son who's now going off to university, he's 17 now, but Dewey died before Quinn was 1. And so I can still picture visiting him in the hospital. This is ending on a downer, but visiting him in the hospital, and my little tiny son, was the only thing that got a reaction out of this big ass Dewey who was dying at that point, put his tiny little hand in Dewey's hand and Dewey squeezed it. It was just a beautiful thing. He didn't react when we read the letters from the fans and other people that knew him, but he reacted to my son's little hand. So,
wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stories out there, and I've had a blessed life getting to know so many of these great wrestlers, whether it's having a couple of pops with you guys in person or on online here or whatever it may be.
Oh, and Jen,
well, we really appreciate you, even though your rankings sometime upset a few people who are friends of ours. But we really appreciate you. And writers that cover a history of our business. I guess it was Mike Leno. We have such a great business, but most of it was kayfabe, as we used to say here back in the old days. And guys just don't. But through the medium of and through guys like you and other writers out there. Man, you guys are bringing out a great part of our business that's been forgotten. So we appreciate it. Sometimes it's not really transmitted like that, but you guys have a tough job because trying to satisfy the inside of wrestling and the people who want the complete knowledge and history of it. So, Greg, thank you so much. Tell us how guys can get a hold of you and just it's your books. I know you said you got one coming out real soon, a new one coming out. So tell us a little bit how we can find it.
Thank you both. Oliverbooks.ca is where you can find all my books. They're almost all available on Amazon and whatever, but oliverbooks.ca. And most of the writing we've been doing at slamwrestling.net. We've been there for over 25 years. I mean, who else wrote about John climbing the mountain? But we did. There's just so many things we've written about through the years. There's things that I forget we wrote about because we've been at this so long. We've been fortunate to be able to be a bit of the carekeeper of pro wrestling history, right? Sometimes a guy dies and we're the only ones that write about him, which is really sad, but that's the reality. And we try to take that pretty seriously. And I hope we get, decent traffic numbers sometimes to appreciate that. Again, slamwrestling.net.
And I forgot to bring up my golfing buddy Jim Corderas, who is also from the area. So,
but the funny thing is, like, I love Jimmy, but he lives so far from me. It's actually quicker probably for me to get to Buffalo than it is to get to the other side of Toronto where Jimmy lives. So the chances of us seeing each other are rare unless we both meet somewhere in the middle at a wrestling show.
We were golfing one time and he hits a ball out of bounds or something, whatever. He goes, I'll just drop by where I hit it out. He drops it like 350 yards from the tee. And Jimmy, don't even try. No. He goes, oh, come on. He's the best.
He's a good dude. Yes, absolutely.
He is a good dude.
So I helped with his book, as in I got to read an early version of it. And I said, you need more of this Toronto stuff. We're just tying it all back in here. It's like, you haven't told me about the twin sisters that sat at ringside and like going in on Wood Street at the back. So we want more of those details. So when you reread the book and you read some of that stuff, it's partly because I said, Jimmy, you were there. You lived these experiences. Make sure you tell us about it. We want more than just your WWF stories.
And you look at Jimmy's career with WWE. He was involved in so many of our historical spots, and because he was such a reliable
he was a
and good
great
referee.
Yeah, he was a terrific referee. Good, great guy. But he's a great referee. He was really good at what he did.
Was it one of those things where because he's balding and skinny that made all you guys look better?
That could be it with me if I look at John there.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it. I'm glad we got. I hope your air gets back on, and so there aren't any mooses or molsons that end up in your house.
No, the molsons are good in the house. The moose is bad.
So. The mooses are bad. That's right. Are you gonna be? You're gonna be at the Tragos museum coming up in July?
No, so I'm not gonna make Tragos Thez this year, but I will be at Cauliflower Alley Club. Yeah, so it'll work out good. I know you guys will have a lot of fun without me, but it's still they're both great things.
And thank you for the latest article that you wrote on Tragos Museum too.
Oh, on Tony Gurria, yeah.
On Tony, yeah, that fantastic. Tony's such a deserving guy. I can't believe he's not in the WWE Hall of Fame yet. 5 different partners, world tag team champions there. Maybe one day they'll realize Tony belongs in there.
Amen.
At least put his toupee in there. Tony's the best. He's had that perfect hair for the last 50 years. I've always told him I want to know where he buys his toupee.
Okay, next time I see him, I'll ask. Okay.
Please do. Hey, Greg, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, boys.